Libraries continue to be one of our most important community institutions. They are trusted and safe places where equity and diversity are not buzzwords, but at the core of the services they provide. Libraries inspire and support lifelong learning, from literacy programs for children, computer classes for seniors, to business plan workshops for aspiring entrepreneurs. They create spaces and resources for teens and youth to express themselves through art, writing, and most importantly, through their input and hands-on leadership.
It makes me feel really good knowing that people feel more inclined to come to the library and ask about things and ask for help. Seeing somebody so close in age to them, it gives you so many skills that you wouldn't have gotten if you didn't work at a library.
At the DC Public Library Foundation, our philanthropic investments enhance, expand, and innovate programs where private support can have an outsized impact. Great examples include the Foundation's work during Banned Books Week, where we honor the public library's role as a space for intellectual and creative freedom. The DC Public Library Foundation is more than its programs and events. It's being able to empower people with tangible skills and creating an institution that will continue to inspire lifelong learning.
Libraries store the energy that fuels the imagination. And for the people of DC, the library is more than a place. It's part of who we are. At your fingertips are millions of resources spread across 26 libraries and online. Here, you can explore the history of your city, safely preserved for the ages, and celebrate the rich tapestry of the district and its people. From the Anacostan people of the Piscataway tribe to your neighbors and the many cultures which call the district home. This isn't just a place to be quiet, it's a place to be heard, a place to be seen, a place where you can just be you. Here, we dance to a go-go beat. Here, we know that nothing is more punk than the public library. From story times and reading programs to study spaces for scholars. From computers for job seekers to inspiring spaces for dreamers. Your library goes well beyond books. This is your DC Public Library. Find your story.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. I'm Linnea Hegarty, the Director of Events, Exhibits, and Development for DCPL. We are so thrilled to welcome Candace Taylor and Vann Newkirk to the library to discuss Candace's wonderful book, Overground Railroad, The Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America. As some of you may know, Candace is the leading expert on the Green Book and the curator of the Smithsonian Institution's traveling exhibition, the Negro Motorist Green Book, which we have been so pleased to host here down in the Great Hall since November. I hope you've been able to visit the exhibit downstairs. If you haven't, please stop by on your way out at the end of the program. We also have smaller versions of the exhibition at 8 neighborhood library locations throughout the city. We're very proud to be the last stop of 14 for this important traveling exhibition and the only public library to have hosted it. And in addition to the Smithsonian exhibition about the Green Book's influence nationally, we also created a complementary exhibition, the Green Book in DC, that focuses on the more than 120 Green Book sites in the district and the stories of the men and women who ran those businesses. This was a momentous project for DCPL, the largest exhibition that we have ever hosted, and we are very grateful to Candace and the Smithsonian Exhibition Traveling Exhibit Services team, many of whom are here tonight, for entrusting us to have it here. Thank you to Marquette, Elizabeth, Patrick, Calder, and many others who've been so instrumental in the project. James Beard Award finalist and a 2020 11th Hour Fellow at New America. Last year, Newkirk was named Journalist of the Year by the Washington Association of Black Journalists. As I mentioned, Candace Taylor is an award-winning cultural documentarian and the author of the best-selling book, Overground Railroad, which made the New York Times Most Notable Books of the Year, Oprah Magazine's Top 26 Travel Books, and National Geographic's Top 10 list of books by women. Taylor was a fellow at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University under the direction of Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. Her projects have been commissioned and funded by many organizations, including the Library of Congress and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Her work has been featured in over 80 media outlets. Welcome to you both, and thank you for coming. I know we're all looking forward to this conversation.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Candace, for joining us today. Thank you, everybody in this room, for braving the coldest February of all time to join us. If you somehow managed to tiptoe around the exhibition downstairs, again, please, on your way out, on another day, go check it out. It's amazing. And I want to start by actually asking you, Candace, about that exhibit. Can you tell us more about it?
Well, the exhibition was, a long time in the making. I started doing the research for this project in 2013, and it was a few years before I started having introductory, just exploratory conversations with the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service. And it launched in 2020 and has been touring ever since. It was only supposed to tour a few years, but because of the interest and the impact, we've kept it going, and it's just an honor that this is our last venue in the nation's capital in this time in particular. And this is my first time seeing the show here, yes, as of yesterday, so I'm just thrilled. And thank you again for everybody for coming out during the bad weather, but we made it.
Well, can you also tell us more about the Green Book, about your work detailing the history of this amazing guide that I've had on shelves at home? My father's a historian, so I've seen it, but I think you were able to get into the meat of it, the actual phenomenon of the Green Book. And can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read in the panels downstairs, the Green Book was a travel guide for Black people. It started in 1936 and was published for nearly 3 decades, ended in 1966. And it was really a life-saving tool that Black folks used on the road. And until I really understood, I stumbled into this project by accident, really. I was asked to write a book on Route 66, which was something a travel guide, and I did it for the money because I needed it. But I thought, and it was one of those moments where, in the middle of doing research for that project, because 98, and I'm being maybe generous, %, because I could not find one Black person who had written a major travel guide on Route 66 at the time. All of those books have been written by white men, and when I found out that half the counties on Route 66, because there were 89 of them, 44 of those counties were sundown towns. And sundown towns, for those who don't know, were all white communities. They were all white on purpose. And I thought, well, how in the world did Black people drive Route 66? And I started asking those questions, went down the rabbit hole, found out there was this thing called the Green Book. That was the first time I'd learned about it, and then I was off to the races. So it was one of those aha moments when you look up at the sky and you're like, oh, this is why I'm doing this thing I don't really think I want to do, but this was the reason why I was roped into the Route 66 travel guide, and I was like, this is the project. So it just took on from there.
I think if you ask people who know about the Green Book where the most common sites or where the most difficult places for Black folks to travel through, they tell you the Deep South. But I think your work shows that a lot of these sundown towns, a lot of them in the Midwest, a lot of them are on Route 66. One of them was actually Ferguson, Missouri. What do we need to know about the geography of race in America to help understand the Green Book?
Yeah, I think the South gets a bad rap, right? It's kind of
Indeed.
It's demonized in this way where it was like, oh, that was where the colored and the white signs were, and that was where the real, brutal racism was. And yes, the majority of the lynchings were happening in the South, but Jim Crow had no borders, right? So I learned that very early on doing this research, that the majority of the sundown towns were really a northern and midwestern construct, and all the way out in California. There were thousands of them all over the country, and the majority of them, just to give you an example, there were over 400 sundown towns in the state of Illinois, but only a handful in Mississippi, right? So the South had a different tactic, and of course, not saying it's more or less racist, but the reality was the North went through kind of covert operations to segregate the races. So whether it was redlining or urban renewal or building bridges just so low that buses couldn't go out to the beaches or to the recreation spaces because they assumed only black people could ride the bus, but black people had cars too, and some black people were middle class and had money. So but that was to even change the infrastructure, to go that far, to change FHA loans and redlining, and to go through all of these covert operations that the North handled very eloquently. It's a lot harder to fight something that you can't quite see. When you see a colored sign, okay, that's not right. But that's, I think, what made it so insidious when you look at the geography of how we handled race in this country. And then, of course, the West, is supposed to be known for being so progressive and liberal. And yet, they had a variety of sundown towns. They had sundown towns for black folks and for Asian folks and for Latino. I mean, it was pretty extensive. So I think it's really, to me, the South was just more honest, in saying, this is where you can be and this is where you shouldn't be. And if you were traveling, especially with your family or even by yourself, you needed that information. There were no maps of sundown towns. So it's not like you could plan your route and say, I'm going to avoid this area to stay safe. But what the Green Book did was it gave you those clusters, those neighborhoods, where it was almost like a black-yellow pages, where you could not just find a place to rest and get a meal. You could get your hair done, you could go, there were nightclubs and tailors and drugstores. It was every kind of business you think you might need on the road.
For me, I originally thought the Green Book was just a directory, right? I thought there were just locations, there were addresses, but it actually did quite a bit more than that. Can you tell me about there were editorials, there were photographs. They actually calibrated this book annually to sort of meet where black folks were socially.
Yeah, well, first I want to just mention quickly that, the creators of the Green Book, Victor and Alma Green, were from Harlem. And when Victor started in 1936, he started the Green Book, and he was living in the Sugar Hill district with his wife, and they were pretty fabulous, a fabulous couple. Always dressed to the nines and didn't have money, but they had a lot of class. And when Victor started the Green Book, he was really solving his own problem, because most people assumed that Harlem, especially after the 1920s, was this mecca for black culture. And in some ways it was, but it was still highly segregated. So half the shops on 125th Street were still segregated. And when he created the Green Book, he thought, well, this is something we can use here. But it was so popular and so necessary, within a few years, it had spread to every state east of the Mississippi River. And then it just kept growing. And of course, as it grew in the earlier editions, you can see the graphic design choices. He starts making real measured decisions about what the guide looks like. He went to a white a Jewish publisher, Gibraltar, in Midtown Manhattan. And for this 6-foot-tall black man in a dapper suit walking into Midtown Manhattan, I had the pleasure of interviewing and meeting the Glenner family, who he was the son of his father who started printing the Green Books, and said it was just phenomenal. We'd never seen, this is a man who probably wouldn't have been served coffee down the street in Midtown. He walks into our place of business with opportunity, and they saw that, and they published the Green Books for a while, and you can see, like I said, the graphic design, how it changes over the first editions, but you also see that it's functioning more as like a Yellow Pages, that there's this huge variety of businesses. And then you see by the time 1954 and the Brown versus Board of Education is on, they figured it's inevitable that integration is coming. And then you see the Green Book change, and it looks more like a AAA guide. It's just food and lodging and what you would expect. So yeah, you get to see how history and legislation really shapes how the guide looks.
And this is not just I think the way I often think about it is as a guide for tourists, right? For people who want to go visit somewhere else. But this was also a critical piece of the Great Migration of people who were moving places permanently and trying to figure out how to get there, and also how to visit and build these networks with family who were between areas, right?
Right. I mean, that's that's why we just say it was so much more than a travel guide. It's hard to even call it that. I mean, it was kind of this license to leave, right? It gave you, especially for those who were fleeing racial terror in the South during the second wave of the Great Migration, was well underway during the heightened years of the publication of the Green Book. So you see all of these folks, in one of the images here you saw the different pathways during the Great Migration that people took, and you can trace that to, how the Green Book was so critical. Whether you were driving on a train, wherever you landed, you needed to find that place of where the culture was rich, where it was, where you were safe and it was vibrant. And more than anything, it was a source for Black entrepreneurship, the ingenuity of all these different kinds of ways because of segregation that we had to figure out our own and take care of our own in ways that were really impactful. And again, the Green Book was this, I'll tell you just a quick background of how it even got into those communities. We know that ExxonMobil, who's our sponsor for this, but it was Esso gas stations who distributed the guide. And when you look at how you could go to any Esso station and pick up a Green Book, but also it was Victor Green, who was a postal worker. He had this kind of he had a 7th grade education, did not have a business degree, but had this multi-pronged marketing strategy that was really effective. And so when you look at Victor Green, who's, working as a postal worker, he's in the union, there's a Black postal workers union because it's segregated, and those are the folks that are going out to these communities because they had to go to the Black communities, and they're telling these business owners about the Green Book, saying, hey, advertise here. It was free to advertise, and it was a win-win.
For your work on Overground Railroad, you actually visited a lot of these places, right? What are some that sort of stick in mind for you?
It's hard. It's like picking your favorite children or something.
Who's your favorite child?
If I'm pressed, I'd have to say, Murray's Dude Ranch. Mm-hmm. It really is special, and for those of you who haven't seen the exhibit, or if you try and look for the Murray's Dude Ranch section, because there's some artifacts and things that I found digging around in the dirt in the desert. But it's I've traveled over 100,000 miles driving throughout the country documenting these sites. I've scouted over 7,000 of them, and I photographed about 300 of them. And, you know, most of them are gone, obviously. 80%, I would estimate that the buildings are gone. So they're just, or modified beyond recognition. And then you have maybe less than 5% that are still operating. And so Murray's Dude Ranch is gone, but it's still that land. It was a Negro dude ranch. It was run by a black family, the Murrays, and it was they had horses, and Pearl Bailey buys it in the 50s for like $65,000. It is just one of those. Ebony Magazine did a feature on it. Life Magazine did a feature. It was so phenomenal that this thing existed. Lena Horne would show up, and they have great photographs in these huge article spreads that we have, you know, in some of the displays. But I found just pieces of tile digging around 115-degree weather, you know, and I'd been to that site so many times. It just looks like a piece of land in Victorville, California. It's off Route 66 in the Mojave Desert. But it was just such an unusual, there were black westerns filmed there, the Bronze Buckaroo. I think you can see it on YouTube. So yeah, there's just, it just is this, I think, place where you could get respite, where you could be in nature, where you could have solace and serenity. And like I said, it was one of the first places black and white children swam together. It was integrated. It was pretty special.
We spoke backstage about how you were interested in places that were in locations that were run by women and also that provided services for women. Can you tell us more about those?
Yeah, that was one thing that surprised me, because by the time I had done several years of research for this project, I thought, you know, I mean, there was stuff I stumbled on that was interesting, but nothing that really shocked me until I found out so many women who ran businesses in the Green Book. Because you have to remember, this was a time when women couldn't have bank accounts or credit cards, and yet somehow they were, you know, these business owners. And you look at, gosh, there were probably over 1,400 tourist homes, first of all, that were in the Green Book. They were run by widowed women. Largely, they either had like an extra bedroom and they could cook a warm meal, and especially during the Great Migration, that was really critical for all these rural areas, because so many of the Green Book sites were clustered in cities, and especially the larger hotels and, you know, places where you could really find, you know, where you could really land. And yet the tourist homes were so important because these were in the areas on the way to those cities. And those were the places that sometimes were the most dangerous and where the most sundown towns were. So the tourist homes are really important. And, you know, I think they were pretty much a first Airbnbs. We did that, right? So that to me is, you know, again, something that I stumbled onto that I didn't realize. It's like, how did I not know about this? And then there were women who were running beauty salons, and about 900 hair salons were in the Green Book. And then there were barber shops too, but the beauty shops are really important because these were sites of active resistance. They were places where, you know, women would get their hair done and they'd get their NAACP literature sent to the beauty shop because it was considered you were a target if you had NAACP literature. So you didn't want it coming to your house, so they'd have it sent to the beauty shop. And then while you were, you know, somebody was getting their hair done under the hairdryer, the hairdresser, the stylist, would literally, on voting day, take people from her shop to the voting booth, you know? And so these were really critical places of not just, you know, travel and to get your hair done and to be, you know, they really did operate in functional ways that were really critical in how we moved the country forward when we needed to. And then there was a woman who ran a sex club that was in the Green Book in Harlem. I mean, there was just all these great stories. and that you could make movies out of, So that was really exciting to me.
Yeah, I think one thing that struck me was the fact that these were not, like you said, just way stations or places for people to fuel up while they were traveling. These were communities. These were places where they could stop and be safe. And one thing that the Overground Railroad makes clear is how they were all connected, how there was so much back and forth information going between them, and how that sort of fomented a unified culture, even though people were separated by distance. So when you were traveling these towns, were there, I guess, when you were going to small places that are, some of them that are still around, did you find commonalities between people? Did they know about the other towns? Did they know about the other spots in the Green Book? Had they talked to them?
Do you mean the towns that I was scouting for modern day Green Books?
Yes.
Yeah. A lot of during the research, because when I first started this project, very few people even knew about the Green Book. I remember calling my parents right after I found my first one, and my stepfather Ron knew about it, but my mom didn't know. And so it's been an interesting evolution, because now Green Book is almost branded with Black travel, right? So now it's gone almost too far the other way, because people know they think Green Book is just Black travel, but they don't know there's really this history that's tied to it with these particular places. So yeah, when I would find a place and say, you were in the Green Book, sometimes they wouldn't even know what the Green Book was. Other times they would say, oh, well, what does that mean? Other people, I'd say, well, do you know if your grandparents maybe had one? Because the last one just sold for about $50,000 off of you. And they're like, really? So some people would get really, they'd come up to this realization of how rare and special these sites are. But then now it's become more popular, and I think people are more excited that they're in the Green Book. But yeah, no, I'd have to say I did do, 2021, I went to about 97 former sundown towns. And that was interesting, because I really wanted to see where the country was and what especially after Charlottesville, what kind of iconography that I'm seeing that's been repeated in some of these places. And a lot of the towns that actually moved on had Black mayors, so it was and then there were others that really hadn't. So I think when you're talking about how this history evolves in terms of race and access and just awareness of how this history kind of keeps repeating itself, right? That to me has been a real kind of eye-opener, and how much people really don't. We always think that the time we're living in now is in and of it's like we're in this bubble, and yet all I could see when I was doing this research was this continuum and all these echoes. So yeah, I think there was more repeated conversations.
I'm going to open up the floor for questions in just a moment, and so get all your amazing questions ready, please. You mentioned in the beginning of your last answer your stepfather, Ron, and he is all up in the book. He's all over the book. He's very important to the book. Tell us more about Ron.
Ron, he was my stepfather. His name is Ron Burford. And the chauffeur's hat downstairs, that story, there's a quote, actually, about a chauffeur's hat, and that's my stepfather's quote. And I opened up Overground Railroad, that book, with his story that he told me, because I'd known this man since I was 12 years old, and he's a dark-skinned Black man from the South, grew up in Tennessee and in Memphis, and was, loved to tell stories. He was a Southerner through and through, and could start on a story and that you'd heard before. And we'd always, he'd go into another story, we'd be like, okay, we heard that, and you try and scoot out of the kitchen while somebody else comes in. So I was home in Ohio one Christmas, and he started in one of his stories, and I thought, okay, and I'm looking for the exit. And then, but he told me a story he'd never told me before. And it wasn't until I started this project that he shared the realities of what it was like growing up in the Jim Crow South. These were things I had never heard, and he's this, big Marine, lots of testosterone, sweet guy, huge teddy bear, but, intimidated pretty much every boyfriend I had and could train the Rottweiler like nobody's business. But he had this vulnerability that I'd never seen, and he had never shared it with me until that day. And he tells me a story about them as, when he was a kid, he was 7 years old, and they were driving north and got pulled over by a sheriff. And when the sheriff pulled him over, his father, they had a nice car with all the kind of modern amenities. His father worked for the railroad, and his wife was in the front seat, and Ron was in the back seat, and the sheriff pulled him over and said, whose vehicle is this? Where are you going, and who are these people with you? And Ron had been told to be quiet before the sheriff came to the window. And his father said, he's like, this is my employer's car. He looked at his wife, he pretended he didn't know her, and said, she's the maid, and that's her son in the back, and I'm driving them home. And he's like, well, where's your hat? The sheriff asked where his hat was, and he goes, oh, it's hanging right in the back, officer. And Ron looked over, and there was this chauffeur's hat that had always been hanging. He said it was always there. Nobody ever used it. He didn't know what it was, but that was, the prop that kept them safe. And he said he saw it in nearly every black man's car after that, and then he knew what that was. And so I found a lot of, it was interesting because, Ron dies literally 2 weeks before I'm starting to write the book, and I'm just devastated because when I started doing this project was when we would have these long conversations when I was on the road, and I was getting to know this whole other side to him that I'd never known, and I was really becoming more kind of attached to having him around, I guess. And so he died suddenly, and I called my agent, and I was just wake up before the sun would come up. I was in the Bisbee, it's a long story, but the sun was coming up, and I'd just be crying, and I was just like, I'm just gonna write down all Ron's stories, because I didn't want to forget them. And I said, I know I'm supposed to be writing the book, because I only had 8 months to write this book, but I said, I'm gonna write his stories, I'm gonna open up Overground Railroad with Ron in the chauffeur's hat. And Chris, my agent, said, just keep going, just don't worry about it, just write Ron's stories. And so they become touchstones in nearly every chapter of the book. His grandparents had a juke joint, and so all those stories get to come alive in the book, and he becomes this narrative thread. And had he not died, that wouldn't have happened. So it's kind of bittersweet, and he was such a ham, so he loves that we're all talking about him, I know. I did a talk in Appalachia, and it was all like 90% of the audience was these older white ladies. And during the Q&A, one raised her hand. She was like, is your next book going to be about Ron? And I was like, oh my God. So yeah, it really, he humanizes this history in a way that I could access it in there's the fourth chapter about war, because Ron went to Vietnam. The whole way I understood this history changed after all those conversations and that experiences with him. So it's just worked out that it was an honor that we get to that it's in print, and that we keep his memory alive.
Well, I'd say this is a book about Ron, so yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that. Before I open the floor up for questions, just a very quick question. How in the world did you finish a book in 8 months? Just for me as a person writing a book.
I didn't do anything else. I mean, thankfully I'd started the research, 7 years earlier. So it was, all the...
So it's really 7 years.
Yeah, no,
So I'm going to tell my editor 7 years.
yeah, right. And the field research took so many years. So by the time I was like, I am here, I have to write the book, I can't go anywhere, I don't have any, what I have is what I have. And that's what's in the brain and what's in the archives. So it was a real, it was a marathon. But yeah, when I turned it in, I remember sending it to my agent and I was like, just let me know if it's like, makes sense. I had no idea. I mean, the fact that it got all these awards and everything, I was just like, I just want it to make sense. And my editors were, it was just meant to be, I guess. Yeah.
All right, now, let's open it up. We do have a microphone, so it will travel to you. What about right here?
Oh, I could have used my outdoor voice. But I was sitting here and I was listening, and one of the questions that popped into my mind is that there's been a lot of conversation over the last few years about Lake Lanier and Oscarville, the city that's underneath of it, that used to be, a Black, town of people, Seneca Village in New York, which now is Central Park. And so how many of those former Black towns that no longer exist, that were raised off the map, are linked back to the Green Book?
Yeah, that's really a question for Van, because that's his next project. But, there's Robbins, Illinois, right? That was actually in the Green Book. And then there were a lot of Black towns in Oklahoma that were, and I didn't find a true kind of thoroughfare or overlap. It was more random that some of these, but I don't know if, it's off the top of my head, I think it's a 1951 edition. If you go to NYPL Green Book, if you Google that, they've digitized, the Schaumburg is digitized, all the Green Books. And I think you'd like to read that article on Robbins, because it was really kind of the, it's emblematic of really what happened to a lot of these places. And again, look at his forthcoming book on the subject, because it will really maybe find more patterns. But from what I could tell with Robbins, it was a lot of the similar stories of, had this heyday, it had all this real vested interest and, in support from the community, and then the disinvestment and all of the, things that happened. And a lot of, you can find parallels with that with Green Book sites. When integration happened was when, we got what we wanted but lost what we had. And so that's the pattern that I see. But yeah, if for some reason you can't find the edition, if it's not in the 51, I'm easy to find online, and I can tell you what it is.
Well, now the pressure's on. So the book is about Black towns that are being destroyed by environmental problems and climate change. And so that is one of the answers, unfortunately, for a lot of early Black towns. Floods, droughts, you name it. Fires, now we see. All right.
Thanks so much for the informative presentation, and I really enjoyed the exhibit downstairs. I was talking about the exhibit with a friend of mine who is Black, and she said, maybe only half jokingly, I wonder if we need a Green Book today. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And when I first started the project, again, it was 2013, Barack Obama was president. So people said, oh my God, I can't believe there was even a need for such a guide, or I didn't know such a thing existed. And also you should know there were nearly a dozen Black travel guides. So the Green Book wasn't the only one, it wasn't the first one, but it's the one that had the longest publication and the most, it was over 2 million people used it. So really though, it was one of, once 2016 came in, obviously, and the political winds were shifting, then people were just, fire alarm, oh my God, we need another Green Book, we need another Green Book, But I always say that I think in terms of, and there are kind of digital forms of like Green Book projects that are going on, and it's kind of taken a life of its own. And in terms of celebrating Black entrepreneurship, I think it's always a good thing to have guides that highlight Black businesses. However, we have to remember that the Green Book and Victor Green was solving a very particular problem. Victor Green dies in 1960, so he doesn't even see the passage of the Civil Rights Act, right? But that's really what, and he wrote in so many editions in the beginning, one day we will not, there will come a day when we won't need this guide. And so that was the goal, and that day did come because the laws did change, and we could go into practically any place of business. It was no longer illegal for us to be there. Now today we can go to those places, we're not guaranteed to be treated fairly, but the goal was that you could go. And so that, in that way, we have turned that corner. However, I think, when we talk about, I think the energy spent on using the brand of Green Book to just say, oh, there's more access, it's like, well, what about the capital, investments and things that really bring true equality for these Black businesses? And that's the thing I think that should be highlighted and focused on, rather than it just be kind of like travel access, because the truth is, we are legally allowed to go into places, but why can't we still have equality through the, these businesses and the access of how successful they are? And again, highlighting those businesses, I think, are really important that some of these guides do, but it's complicated.
Good evening. I had a question regarding your research as far as you talked about your stepfather and this oral history and how you connected things that, because I'm thinking like a lot of the things in the Green Book maybe weren't recorded, or when people and families were traveling, it wasn't necessarily recorded. So how are you putting together like oral histories and also what you could find that was actually recorded or written down, and how you were piecing these pieces of research together?
Yeah, I love, I was so lucky to get a fellowship at the Schomburg Center in New York, because that's where Victor Green's office was, right down the street, and it was the nexus, it was the home, spot where all this stuff started. And then having the fellowship at Harvard helped a lot with the scholarly research. Going into the archives at ExxonMobil actually was interesting. I think the majority of how it's always a needle in a haystack kind of thing. So finding the existing Green Book sites was the first order of business. So it was a field research that I spent most of the time and resources on. Once I found some of the less than 5% of businesses that were still operating, and then interviewing those business owners. So those were most of like the oral histories that came from that research. And finding again those family-owned businesses that still were connected to the same families were really hard. So every layer it got, this history got further and further away from me. But again, that's why Ron's stories were so important, because not only did he humanize a history, he actually had the experience in the window in which I could, say, oh, this is happening in my own family. And then I talked to other people and they could see it in their families too. So it was a lot of the Green Book sites, like the beauty shops and all of that, if you can imagine, we don't keep those records generally. And unfortunately, all of the business records for Victor Green are gone. Nobody's ever been able to find them. So really it's like finding, somebody who had letterhead, or it was just these fragments of materials. But, I've still been working on this project, even though it's been long after it's been published, to archive and gather as much history as we can. But, people like Leah Chase, from Dookie Chase's restaurant in New Orleans. There's some of those that are really kind of iconic, right? So those are, special. But it was finding the, Loper's tire service in St. Louis, you know, and to have it was his father and his grandfather who ran that place. Like, those were the ones that were really special. And the Library of Congress has archived some of those stories. So if you Google my name, Library of Congress, you'll see some of those interviews that we were able to save.
I want to start by saying thank you for putting this. I'm right here. Here we go. I want to start by saying thank you for putting this exhibit together, putting this book together. I stumbled across the exhibit weeks ago, and every time I visited the library, I've made it a point to work through each of these panels. And every anecdote is special. I learn something new every single time. The anecdote about the hat, about Murray's Dude Ranch, about why it was so difficult to get businesses in the Mountain West to get into the Green Book. I'm curious to know, because this is a book that stopped publishing back in the 60s, but I feel like your book has breathed new life into this topic. What is it that you're hoping folks will take away from reading this book or doing their own research into the Green Book?
Thank you for all those kind words of support. And yeah, it's, when I first came back off my 3-year trip, my things were just in storage. I didn't even have a home. I was just on the road for 3 years. And when I did that field research and stopped to write the book, I rewrote the book proposal because I knew, at first I pitched this idea of, it's just going to be the Green Book sites and we're going to look at this history. But I was like, no, what is happening today? Once I went into these communities that were once Green Book sanctuary, vibrant places that are no longer, that are just struggling on such a primal human level. It's unconscionable what's happened to some of these places in Detroit and Cleveland and Baltimore. And I went back to my publisher, to Abrams, and I said, hey, I'll write the book that I sold to you, but I think there's a better book here. And it really looks at the context of what's happening now. And so I'm hoping that some of those things that you're reading and some of the things you see in the exhibit, remind you of what these neighborhoods or what your neighborhood looks like today and how gentrification has really played out and shaped your community and the fact that it was just one man with a 7th grade education, right, who made all of these changes. He didn't need a business degree to make systemic change for the better. The fact that when you facilitate that kind of wave of migration in a way that people were moving anyway, but to have these moments and communities where people built businesses and families and music and food and all of those things that changed the way people ate in the North, and listened to music in the North, that just, it takes one little thing that can create, a lot of magic. And I feel like when we think we need to do big things, we think we need a lot of money or we need big degrees or we need, and you don't. And I feel like Victor Green was kind of like the Steve Jobs of his time, And so I hope people see themselves in their own histories and their own places of where we have our own power. We each have our own, after the pandemic, people were like, oh my God, what's happening with Black America? What can I do? And I'm like, I don't know, what can you do? It's like, only you know. And so I'm hoping that the exhibition really inspires people to be motivated to find their own place and where they can make change.
Well, Steve Jobs was the Victor Green of his era.
That's fair.
I think we have one more question.
That's fair.
Good evening. I'm here on the behalf of my wife, who is in Las Vegas. She's the president of the Harrison House, Las Vegas. And it is a historic what we call now a Green Book destination. And I'm so sad to hear that many of these places have now been reduced to just records, quote unquote records. But my wife invested her personal funds to help restore this property, which was scheduled for demolition. But it is so connected to the surrounding history of Las Vegas. I mean, this house was the place where some of the best entertainment in the world could live and eat, because they weren't allowed in the casinos that, you know, Las Vegas is known for today. So I recognize that these kinds of places connect to the larger history, and if we don't value them, then no one else will, because she had to fight, first of all, just to maintain the property. And now she's trying to protect it from, quote unquote, development, which does not want to recognize the history of the community. So these are some of the issues that we're dealing with. So I'm so grateful for your book, and certainly want a copy of your book. We're one of 2 places that are listed in the state of Nevada. Now it is listed as a National Historic Site. But I hate to think of the demise of the many other places that are so significant to American history. And so I just want to encourage everybody to support, you know, whatever efforts to maintain such places. And your statement about we got what we want, but we lost what we had. Could you tell me the origins of that statement? Is that your?
Oh no, that's Georgia Ayers, and it's in our exhibition. She's from the Hampton House in Miami, Florida, and that, you know, and thank you for what you said and for your work, and it's really important because the preservation of these sites is something I care really deeply about, and I did work with the National Park Service to rewrite the context on valuing these places, right? So any place that was in a black travel guide now, because a lot of times they have these architectural standards, and you know about this because in most of the Green Book businesses were built in places that were flood zones, under, you know, served communities that didn't, and so the buildings aren't as pristine, or they had to be modified for all kinds of economic reasons. And then according to the National Registry, it's not, you know, we can't put it on the list because it's not pure, it's not, you know, yeah. And so I'm hoping, you know, I rewrote the context to help change that, so that, you know, is your place on the National Register, or you said it was? Yes, it's on the National Register now, yeah, which doesn't really say that it still can be vulnerable. It doesn't make it, you know, it's not foolproof, but that is one step. And the Harrison House in Miami was really, it underwent like a $9 million renovation. The Dewdrop in New Orleans underwent like almost a $10 million renovation. Clifton's underwent, I mean, these things, they cost a lot of money, and they take a lot of love from, you know, from everybody involved. So yeah, preservation, that's the only way we even can keep visiting this history and, you know, and appreciating it and hopefully saving it. Yeah, thank you for, you know, and please, come speak to me after, and I'd love to sign your book, or just wish your, is it your wife? Or yeah, to wish her well, and thank you.
Well, I think that is time, but I do want to have one more question, because I think I watched a crowd, for the first time I've ever seen people clap for a library hype reel during the part where they mentioned diversity and equity, obviously very charged words today. And I did want to ask you, you know, I think it's no secret now that this type of work, the type of history that you are doing, the idea of using and leveraging Black history, those are things that are at risk right now, at least the way that we've known it for the past few decades. Does that give you more urgency for the work that you do?
Well, I mean, like I said, I'm kind of I work 16 hours a day anyway, so I'm just working. And, you know, I've lost jobs because of this new, you know, development. And I think I may gain a few jobs too from it. So I think if anything, you know, to me, it's always been urgent. And I don't act any differently because of this situation. You know, I take it just as seriously as I did a year ago. Because there's always forces. And these forces have been there. I mean, what, 200 anti-lynching laws went up before Congress over this entire time, and it just got passed under the Biden administration. Who do you think is in there? Right? So, you know, again, it's like the difference between the North and the South. It's just more visible. We just have the colored signs now. It doesn't make it any more or less dangerous, I don't believe. I think, you know, people are getting killed already during the Obama administration, right? So to me, it's creating a new awareness for those who do want to keep their heads in the sand about the reality of the country that we live in. Now, that's also to say that, you know, we have made progress in some regards. You know, we are trying to do something. We're a young country. We are not entitled to democracy. We're trying to do something that no other country has ever even attempted to do. We're failing, but we're trying to do it. And the opposition is always, they didn't go anywhere. So they're you know, resurfacing now because we shamed them into silence, but they didn't go away. So to me, it's just a reality that yes, you know, because I love reading about history, but now we're living through it. And this is what living through history feels like. But that's okay. You know, I think as much as there's so many people, because they're heightened and they're scared, who do want to, you know, and to see that you don't take it for granted now and you see that real, that you clap for it because we just felt like, oh, well, that's, you know. And so, no, I think you appreciate more when you fear you're going to lose it. And it took this to wake some people up. So that's what I feel.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all. And don't freeze.
Please give another hand to Candace Taylor and Van Newkirk. Just a reminder that Candace's book will be available on the ground level on the east side of the exhibition. There'll be our volunteers that are distributing 50 complimentary copies on behalf of the DC Public Library Foundation. So grab a copy and she will sign it. Thank you, and thanks for making the library part of your day.